Around 170,000 years ago, in a cave in South Africa, something changed in a small group of humans that had nothing to do with tools or fire. They started covering their bodies. Not because the weather demanded it. The weather hadn't changed at all. Right now, you probably think you know why clothing exists. Cold nights, harsh winters, a practical solution to a practical problem. That explanation feels obvious, which is exactly why almost nobody has stopped to check it against the actual timeline of our species. Once you do, the obvious explanation falls apart almost immediately. Here's the first piece of the puzzle, and it comes from an unlikely source: lice. Not head lice, body lice. The kind that live exclusively in fabric and can only survive by clinging to clothing rather than skin. In 2003, a team led by biologist Mark Stoneking realized something strange. Body lice are a separate species from head lice, and separate species take time to evolve apart from a common ancestor. By comparing the genetic divergence between the two, the team could calculate roughly when body lice first had somewhere new to live. In other words, they could date the invention of clothing using evolution itself as a clock. The number that came back was staggering, roughly 170,000 years ago. A follow-up study in 2011, led by geneticist Melissa Toops, refined that estimate and confirmed it. Humans had been walking around fully modern, fully upright, fully hairless for a very long time before that number. So the question isn't just why we started wearing clothes. It's why we waited so long to do it. To understand that gap, you have to go back much further, to when we lost our fur in the first place. Humans are one of the only mammals on Earth with almost no body hair. And the leading explanation is thermoregulation. Around 1 to 2 million years ago, our ancestors on the African savanna needed to run long distances in extreme heat while hunting, a strategy some researchers call persistence hunting, chasing prey animals for hours until the animal collapsed from heat exhaustion, while the human, cooling constantly through sweat, kept going. A furry body traps heat against the skin the same way a coat does. A bare, sweat-covered body sheds it instantly into the air. So natural selection stripped away the fur and replaced it with something far more effective. Roughly 2 million sweat glands per person, more than almost any other mammal alive, turning the human body into one of the most efficient heat-dumping machines in the animal kingdom. But losing your fur creates a new problem immediately. Bare skin under direct equatorial sun burns, blisters, and eventually kills through skin cancer and heat damage. So the body adapted again. In 2004, geneticist Alan Rogers led a study analyzing the MC1R gene, the gene responsible for skin pigmentation. His team calculated that dark, UV protective skin evolved at almost exactly the same time our ancestors lost their body hair, somewhere around 1.2 million years ago. So here's where things get strange. By roughly 1.2 million years ago, humans already had a fully engineered solution to being naked in the sun. No fur, dense sweat glands, and skin dark enough to block harmful radiation. It worked. It had been working for the better part of 1 million years, which means clothing didn't show up to solve a problem that already had a solution. It showed up almost 1 million years after the naked body system was already running smoothly. There's a strange follow-up chapter buried in that same pigmentation research, and it runs in the opposite direction. Once clothing entered the picture and humans began migrating out of equatorial Africa into regions with far less sunlight, dark skin stopped being useful and started being a liability. Skin needs UV exposure to synthesize vitamin D, and heavily pigmented skin blocks most of that exposure. Populations that pushed into northern latitudes, wrapped in hides that already covered most of their bodies, faced a new pressure. The little skin left exposed needed to absorb as much weak northern sunlight as possible. Geneticists have traced multiple independent mutations for lighter skin appearing over the following tens of thousands of years, across different populations moving into Europe and Asia. In a strange loop, the very thing that first evolved to guard against too much sun helped set up the conditions for skin that could no longer survive without it. So what actually happened around 170,000 years ago that made a group of humans in a South African cave decide to start covering themselves? The timing lines up with something else. And this is where the story stops being about survival at all. Around the same window, Roughly 100,000 to 75,000 years ago, archaeologists working at Blombos Cave, not far from where that original body lice population likely lived, uncovered something unexpected. Pieces of ochre engraved with deliberate geometric crosshatch patterns. Small perforated shells, worn smooth in a way that only happens from being strung and worn against skin, functioning as beads. Archaeologist Christopher Henshelwood, who led much of the excavation work at the site, has argued these objects represent some of the earliest confirmed evidence of symbolic thought in our species. Deliberate marks and ornaments that carried meaning beyond their physical function. This was symbolic behavior, decoration for the sake of decoration. Humans were not just surviving anymore. They were signaling something about themselves to each other. Clothing appears to belong to that same explosion of symbolic thinking, not to a sudden cold snap. And once you frame it that way, a different explanation starts to make more sense than temperature ever did. A piece of animal hide draped over a shoulder does something a bare body cannot. It marks you. It can signal status, a successful hunt, a particular group identity, even eligibility for mating, in a way that skin alone never could. Anthropologists studying modern hunter-gatherer groups have documented that early forms of clothing and adornment were used far more often to communicate identity than to regulate temperature, even in populations living in genuinely cold environments. There's an even stranger layer buried in the lice data itself. And it's the part almost nobody mentions when they talk about this study. Clothing didn't just protect humans. It created an entirely new evolutionary niche, and something moved in to exploit it almost immediately. Body lice exist today for exactly one reason. Humans gave them a brand new habitat to colonize. We solved one problem and accidentally invented a parasite's paradise in the process. Every itch from a louse infestation across the next 170,000 years of human history traces back to that first decision to wrap something around a shoulder. But identity and status weren't the only forces at work. There's a colder, more literal chapter to this story too, and it comes from a different set of humans entirely. Neanderthals and early modern humans pushing into Ice Age Europe and Northern Asia needed something far more sophisticated than a draped hide. They needed fitted, sewn clothing that trapped body heat the way modern winter gear does. The evidence for this shows up in an unlikely place: eyed needles. Bone needles with a small hole for thread, found at sites like Denisova Cave in Siberia, dating back roughly 40,000 to 50,000 years. A needle with an eye means thread. Thread means seams. Seams mean tailored, insulated clothing, not just a hide thrown over the body. This is the moment clothing finally became what most people already assumed it always was: a survival technology built specifically to handle brutal cold. But notice how late that arrives in the story. Fitted, sewn, cold-weather clothing shows up over 100,000 years after the original body covering habit that the lice data points to. Warmth wasn't the reason clothing was invented. Warmth was a reason clothing was later perfected, once humans pushed into environments that actually demanded it. Here's the complication worth sitting with honestly, because the evidence doesn't point in only one direction. Some researchers argue the earliest coverings in Africa may still have served a practical purpose, just not the one you'd expect. Not warmth, but protection from biting insects, thorny brush, and the intense equatorial sun during long hunts far from shade. It's entirely possible clothing began as a purely functional tool, and only later accumulated symbolic meaning on top of that function, rather than starting as pure status display. The honest answer is that both forces were probably tangled together from the very beginning. Practical protection and social signaling arriving almost simultaneously. And the archaeological record from 170,000 years ago is too sparse to fully separate the two. What we can say with more confidence is this: you get dressed every single morning without thinking about any of this. You choose a color, a fit, a style that says something about who you are before you've spoken a single word to anyone. Nobody hands you a temperature reading before you decide what to wear to a first date, a job interview, or a funeral. You dress for the room, for the people who will see you, for the version of yourself you want them to meet. That instinct, the one that makes clothing about identity as much as insulation, is not a modern invention layered on top of an old survival tool. It may be closer to the original reason the whole thing started. So picture that cave in South Africa again. 170,000 years ago. The temperature outside hadn't changed. The danger from predators hadn't changed. What had changed was something happening inside the group itself. A growing need to be seen as someone, to signal status or belonging or identity through something other than the body they were born with. The first piece of clothing in human history probably wasn't wrapped around a shoulder to survive the night. It was wrapped around a shoulder to say something the body alone couldn't. And in a way, every closet full of clothes since has been saying the exact same thing.